The sun was setting as passengers filed onto Flight 1420 bound for Los Angeles. The golden light streamed through the small oval windows, casting a warm glow across the first-class cabin, where most travelers were already settling in, stowing away their bags and getting comfortable for the 6-hour journey ahead. Among them was Calvin, dressed in a simple but clearly expensive navy tracksuit, his hair braided neatly and a pair of gold-rimmed sunglasses perched on his nose despite the dimming light outside. He moved with a casual confidence that came from years spent in the spotlight as one of hip-hop's most recognizable icons. As he approached his seat, 3A window just as he preferred, he nodded politely to the elderly couple seated across the aisle who were whispering excitedly to each other. Clearly having recognized him. "Good evening," he said in his distinctive drawl, smiling as he slid into his seat. The flight attendant, a woman with kind eyes and a professional demeanor, approached almost immediately. "Can I get you anything before takeoff, sir?" she asked, her name tag reading Amara. "Just some water for now." "Thanks," Calvin replied, already pulling out his phone to send a few last messages before they were instructed to switch to airplane mode. The pre-flight routine continued around him. The hum of conversations, the rustling of magazines, the click of seatbelts. Calvin had done this hundreds of times. Flying was second nature to him now, a necessary part of life on tour and managing his many business ventures. He closed his eyes briefly, mentally preparing for the busy schedule waiting for him in Los Angeles. His moment of peace was interrupted by a voice that cut sharply through the ambient noise of the cabin. "Excuse me." Calvin opened his eyes to see a man standing over him. Not a flight attendant, but someone in a pilot's uniform. Crisp white shirt with captain's stripes on the shoulders, dark pants pressed to perfection, and a face that wore authority like a mask. Captain Richard Wilson, according to his name badge, stood with his hands clasped behind his back, his posture rigid. "Can I help you?" Calvin asked, sitting up straighter, instantly aware that something wasn't right. The captain's expression was a mixture of suspicion and thinly veiled disdain. "I need to check your boarding pass," the captain said, his tone making it clear this wasn't a routine request. Calvin raised an eyebrow but kept his expression neutral. He'd been in enough situations like this to know better than to react with the anger that was already bubbling beneath his calm exterior. Without a word, he reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone, opening the airline app to display his digital boarding pass. "Here you go," he said, holding it up for the captain to see. The pilot glanced at it with narrowed eyes, then looked back at Calvin. By now, the nearby passengers had fallen silent, watching the interaction with uncomfortable attention. "This is a first-class cabin," the captain stated flatly, as if Calvin somehow wasn't aware. "Yes, I know," Calvin replied evenly. "That's what my ticket says. Seat 3A, first class." The captain's jaw tightened. "We've had some issues recently with passengers trying to upgrade themselves without proper authorization." A few seats away, a businessman in a suit who had boarded just minutes before Calvin, and whose boarding pass hadn't been checked, shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Calvin maintained his composure, though his eyes hardened slightly behind his sunglasses. "Is there a problem with my ticket specifically?" The question hung in the air, loaded with unspoken meaning. Everyone in earshot knew what was happening. The captain was not checking everyone's boarding pass. He was not concerned about unauthorized upgrades. He had specifically approached Calvin, the only black passenger currently seated in the first-class cabin. "I'm just doing my job," the captain said, his voice lowering slightly as he became aware of the attention they were drawing. "Certain passengers need to be verified." "Certain passengers," Calvin repeated, his voice level but with an edge that hadn't been there before. "And what makes a passenger certain, Captain Wilson?" The elderly woman across the aisle gasped softly at the direct challenge. Her husband placed his hand over hers, both of them watching with wide eyes. The captain's face flushed slightly. "I didn't mean— What did you mean?" Calvin interrupted, still calm but refusing to let the moment pass unchallenged. "Because I've flown this airline over 30 times this year alone. First class every time, yet somehow I still look like I don't belong here to you." By now, Amara had returned with Calvin's water. Seeing the confrontation, she froze momentarily before placing the glass on his tray table. "Is everything all right here?" she asked, looking between Calvin and the captain. "The captain is concerned about my presence in first class," Calvin explained, his tone deliberately neutral. Apparently, I fit the profile of someone who might sneak in without proper authorization. Amara's professional smile faltered for just a second before she recovered. I checked Mr. Johnson's boarding pass when he came aboard, Captain. Everything is in order. The captain's eyes flicked to Amara, then back to Calvin. The cabin had grown uncomfortably quiet. Even passengers further back who couldn't hear the exchange could sense the tension building. I see, the captain said stiffly. Well, procedure is procedure. Is it procedure to single out only certain passengers? Asked a voice from across the aisle. The elderly man who had been watching the scene unfold had spoken up, his voice carrying the weight of decades of witnessing similar scenarios. Because my wife and I have been sitting here for 20 minutes and you didn't ask to see our boarding passes. The captain turned, clearly not expecting to be challenged by another passenger. Sir, I'm just what? The elderly man pressed. Because from where I'm sitting, it looks like you're harassing this young man for no good reason. Other passengers began to murmur in agreement. A woman 2 rows ahead turned around in her seat, phone in hand, its camera lens glinting in the cabin light. She wasn't recording yet, but the message was clear. One wrong move and this incident would be documented. The atmosphere in the cabin had shifted from uncomfortable to tense. The captain stood rigid, caught between backing down and doubling down on his authority. Calvin remained seated, outwardly calm despite the storm of emotions inside him. This wasn't his first encounter with prejudice, not by a long shot, but it never got easier. I believe, Calvin said finally, breaking the tense silence, that you owe me an explanation, Captain, because we both know this isn't about my boarding pass. The captain's nostrils flared slightly. For a moment it seemed like he might escalate the situation further, but the weight of the watching eyes, passengers and crew alike, seemed to register. Whatever his initial intention had been, he was now at the center of a scene that could easily spiral beyond his control. I apologize if there was a misunderstanding, he said, the words clearly difficult for him to pronounce. Enjoy your flight. He turned to leave, but Calvin's voice stopped him. That's not an apology, Captain Wilson. That's you covering yourself. The directness of the statement caused several passengers to inhale sharply. The captain turned back slowly, his face a mask of barely contained anger and embarrassment. Before either man could speak again, the co-pilot appeared at the entrance of the first-class cabin. He assessed the situation quickly, his experienced eyes taking in the tense postures and silent passengers. Captain, we're ready for the pre-flight check, he said carefully, and boarding is almost complete. The captain hesitated, clearly torn between defending his actions and retreating. Finally, with a curt nod, he turned and followed the co-pilot toward the cockpit. But not before casting one last glance at Calvin, a look that suggested this matter wasn't settled. As they disappeared from view, the cabin gradually returned to its pre-confrontation state. Conversations resumed, though many now centered on what they had just witnessed. Amara approached Calvin again, her expression genuinely apologetic. I'm so sorry about that, she said quietly. That was completely inappropriate. Calvin nodded, taking a slow sip of his water. Not your fault, he said. And not my first time. The elderly couple across the aisle introduced themselves, expressing their own outrage at what had happened. Other passengers stopped by a seat on their way to the bathroom, offering words of support or sharing their own stories. What had begun as an ugly display of prejudice had somehow transformed the first-class cabin into a temporary community united against injustice. As the final boarding call was announced, and the last few passengers hurried aboard, Calvin gazed out the window at the darkening sky. The confrontation had shaken him more than he wanted to admit. Despite his fame, his success, the respect he commanded in his industry, none of it had shielded him from being seen as somehow less deserving, less belonging. But something else was stirring inside him too. Not just anger or resignation, but a determination. This flight was 6 hours long, 6 hours during which he would be sharing a metal tube in the sky with a man who had judged him based solely on his appearance. And somehow Calvin couldn't help but feel that this story wasn't over yet. The cabin lights dimmed as the engines rumbled to life. Calvin fastened his seatbelt, his mind already turning over what would happen next. The safety demonstration video ended, and the plane pushed back from the gate with a gentle lurch. Calvin stared out the window, watching ground crew members grow smaller as the aircraft began to taxi toward the runway. His phone was now in airplane mode, but he held it in his hand, turning it over and over as he processed what had just happened. Across the aisle, the elderly couple whispered to each other, occasionally glancing his way with sympathetic expressions. The woman with the phone 2 rows ahead had finally put it away, though Calvin had noticed her recording discreetly during the confrontation. By tomorrow morning, there would likely be another viral video of a black celebrity being harassed, another hashtag, another news cycle, another round of outrage that would fade until the next incident. Calvin sighed. He was tired of being a hashtag. Amara moved through the cabin, checking that all seatbelts were fastened for takeoff. When she reached Calvin, she paused. "Can I get you anything else?" she asked, her voice low enough that only he could hear. Calvin looked up at her, seeing the genuine concern in her eyes. "Actually," he said, surprising himself with the thought that had just formed, "there is something you could do for me." He leaned closer and spoke quietly. Amara's eyebrows rose slightly, but she nodded. "I'll see what I can do," she promised, continuing her checks through the cabin. The plane lined up on the runway, engines roaring as it gathered speed before lifting into the evening sky. Calvin watched the city shrink beneath them, buildings turning to tiny lights as they climbed through wispy clouds into the darkening blue above. He'd always loved this part of flying, the physical sensation of rising above problems even if only temporarily. But tonight, he couldn't escape into that feeling. The captain's words, and more importantly, the assumptions behind them, had lodged in his mind like a splinter. After decades in the spotlight, after all his success and wealth, after countless awards and recognition, he was still viewed first and foremost through the lens of his skin color by too many people. The seatbelt sign dinged off. Passengers began to shift in their seats, some reaching for tablets or books, others reclining to nap during the flight. Calvin remained still, waiting. 10 minutes later, Amara appeared beside him again. "Mr. Johnson," she said, keeping her professional demeanor despite the unusual nature of his request. "The first officer has agreed to speak with you briefly once. We reach cruising altitude and the captain takes his break. He asked if you could come to the galley area in about 15 minutes. Calvin nodded. "Thank you, Amara. I appreciate it." She smiled and moved away, attending to other passengers. Calvin took a deep breath. He wasn't sure exactly what he hoped to accomplish, but he knew he couldn't sit silently for 6 hours pretending nothing had happened. Not this time. The elderly man across the aisle caught his eye. "Whatever you're planning, son," he said with a knowing look, "I hope it works out. Some people need to learn the hard way." Calvin smiled. "I'm not looking to make trouble," he assured the man. "Just to be heard." "Sometimes that's the most trouble you can make," the man replied with a wink. 15 minutes crawled by. Calvin sipped his water, declined Amara's offer of headphones for the in-flight entertainment, and gathered his thoughts. When she finally gave him a subtle nod, he unbuckled his seatbelt and made his way to the galley area at the front of the first-class cabin. The first officer was waiting, his uniform as crisp as the captain's, but his expression far more open. He was younger, perhaps in his mid-30s, with intelligent eyes that held Calvin's gaze directly. "Mr. Johnson," he said, extending his hand. "I'm First Officer Thomas. I understand there was an incident before takeoff." Calvin shook his hand, noting the firm grip and direct eye contact. "That's one way of putting it," he said. "Is the captain aware we're having this conversation?" Thomas's mouth quirked slightly. "Let's just say Captain Wilson is taking his break, and what happens during his break isn't my concern. We have about 10 minutes before he returns." Calvin nodded, appreciating the frankness. "I'm not here to file a complaint or get anyone in trouble," he began, "though I'd have every right to." "You would," Thomas agreed without hesitation. What the captain did was unprofessional and inappropriate. The straightforward acknowledgement caught Calvin off guard. He'd expected defensiveness, perhaps some attempt to explain away the captain's behavior. The lack of excuses was refreshing. "Then you understand why I couldn't just sit quietly for the next 6 hours, Calvin said. Thomas leaned against the galley counter, arms crossed but posture relaxed. "What do you want to happen here, Mr. Johnson?" Because I should warn you that Captain Wilson is not known for his flexibility of thinking. Calvin considered the question carefully. What did he want? Justice, an apology, to shame someone who had shamed him? None of those felt quite right. I want to talk to him, Calvin said finally. Person to person. No cameras, no audience, no viral moment. Just two men having an honest conversation. Thomas looked skeptical. And you think that will accomplish something? I don't know, Calvin admitted. But I've been in the public eye for over 20 years. I've been hated, loved, misunderstood, and judged more times than I can count. And the one thing I've learned is that people don't change because you shame them. They change when they connect with you. The first officer studied him, clearly reassessing his initial impression. That's surprisingly optimistic, given the circumstances. Calvin shrugged. Don't get me wrong, I'm angry. But I'm also tired of the same old script. The viral video, the public outrage, the forced apology, the sensitivity training that doesn't stick. Maybe it's time to try something different. A moment of silence passed between them as Thomas considered his words. Outside the small galley window, the sky had darkened completely, revealing a scattering of stars above the clouds. I can't promise anything, Thomas said finally, but I can ask him to speak with you when he returns. That's all I'm asking for, Calvin replied. Thomas checked his watch. I need to get back to the cockpit. Wait here and I'll send word through Amara. Calvin nodded and Thomas disappeared through the cockpit door. Left alone in the galley, Calvin took a moment to gather himself. The anger was still there, simmering beneath his calm exterior, but so was something else. A determination to break the cycle, to try something new. Several passengers walking to the bathroom glanced at him curiously as they passed, some offering encouraging smiles or nods of recognition. Word had spread throughout the cabin about what had happened. Calvin acknowledged them with a polite nod but kept to himself, mentally rehearsing what he would say if the captain agreed to speak with him. 5 minutes later, Amara returned to the galley. The captain will be taking his break in about 10 minutes, she informed him. First Officer Thomas asked if you could wait in the crew rest area until then. She pointed to a small door at the side of the galley. It's not much, but it will give you some privacy. Thank you, Calvin said, genuinely appreciative of her help. As he turned to go, she touched his arm lightly. For what it's worth, she said quietly, many of us in the crew saw what happened. We're with you. The small gesture of solidarity meant more than she probably realized. Calvin smiled, the first genuine smile since boarding the plane. That means a lot. The crew rest area was little more than a glorified closet with a fold-down seat, but it offered a moment of solitude that Calvin welcomed. He sat down, closed his eyes and breathed deeply, centering himself for what was to come. He wasn't naive. The chances of a meaningful conversation with someone like Captain Wilson were slim. People rarely changed their deeply held beliefs based on a single interaction. But Calvin had spent his career defying expectations, crossing boundaries and bringing people together through his music and his presence. Maybe, just maybe, he could do it again here. A light knock on the door interrupted his thoughts. Amara stood there, her expression unreadable. The captain is taking his break now, she said. He's agreed to speak with you, but only for 5 minutes. Calvin stood up. 5 minutes is all I need. She led him to another small area near the rear of the first-class cabin, separated from the main seating by a curtain. Captain Wilson stood there, his posture rigid, arms crossed defensively across his chest. His expression was a mixture of annoyance and forced professionalism. Mr. Johnson, he said stiffly. First Officer Thomas says you wanted to speak with me. Amara discreetly withdrew, leaving the two men facing each other in the small space. I do, Calvin confirmed, keeping his voice level. And I appreciate you agreeing to it. The captain's jaw tightened. I want to make it clear that I was simply following protocol earlier. There was nothing personal about it. Calvin looked at him directly, not aggressively, but with unwavering focus. We both know that's not true, he said quietly. And that's why I wanted to talk to you. Not to argue about what happened, but to tell you something about me that you didn't bother to learn before you judged me. For a brief moment, something flickered in the captain's eyes. Not quite shame, but perhaps the first hint of doubt. Calvin saw it, and in that small crack in the armor, he found his opening. "I fly over 100 times a year," he began. "First class, private jets, economy when I'm traveling low-key. I've been to 47 countries. I speak 3 languages. I own businesses that employ hundreds of people. I've performed for presidents and worked with Congress on education reform." He took a step closer, not intimidating but intimate, as if sharing a secret. "And none of it should matter when it comes to how you treat me as a human being." The words hung in the air between them, simple but powerful. The captain's crossed arms loosened slightly, though his expression remained guarded. "What do you want from me?" he asked finally. "An apology? For me to grovel? To say I'm not—" He stopped himself. "Not what?" Calvin pressed gently. "Not racist? I didn't come here to label you. I came here to be seen. As a person, not a problem. Not a stereotype. Not someone who doesn't belong in first class." For the first time, Captain Wilson seemed at a loss for words. The script he had been following, defensive, authoritarian, righteous, no longer fit the conversation Calvin was creating. "5 minutes are almost up," Calvin said, noting the captain's glance at his watch. "But before I go back to my seat, I want you to know something. When we land in LA, there's going to be a decision for both of us to make. You can walk away unchanged, and I can post about this online and let the internet do what it does. Or we can both choose something different." He extended his hand, leaving it hanging in the space between them. "Your call, Captain." Time seemed to stop in that small galley space as Calvin's hand remained extended, waiting for Captain Wilson's response. The hum of the airplane engines filled the silence between them. Passengers occasionally passed by the curtain, unaware of the pivotal moment unfolding just a few feet away. Captain Wilson stared at the offered hand, his face a battlefield of conflicting emotions. Pride warred with shame, defensiveness with curiosity. For a man accustomed to being in control of his aircraft, his crew, his carefully constructed worldview, this moment represented something deeply unsettling, an invitation to uncertainty. Finally, with visible reluctance, he reached out and briefly clasped Calvin's hand. 5 minutes, the captain said, checking his watch again. "That's all I have before I need to return to the cockpit." Calvin nodded, withdrawing his hand. "I appreciate it." An awkward silence followed. The captain clearly expected accusations, demands, or threats, the typical script for these confrontations. When none came, he shifted uncomfortably. "Look," he began, his tone somewhere between defensive and explanatory. "I've been flying for 27 years. I've seen every trick in the book. People trying to sneak into first class, creating disturbances. And how many of those people looked like me?" Calvin interrupted, his voice quiet but firm. The question landed like a stone in still water, creating ripples the captain couldn't ignore. He opened his mouth to respond, then closed it again. "That's what I thought," Calvin continued. "Here's the thing, Captain Wilson. I don't believe you wake up in the morning thinking, 'I'm going to discriminate against someone today.' I think you wake up, do your job, and believe you're treating everyone fairly." The captain's shoulders relaxed slightly at what seemed like understanding. "But," Calvin went on, "when you saw me in first class, something happened in your mind. A snap judgment, an assumption. And instead of questioning that assumption, you acted on it." "I was doing my job," Captain Wilson insisted, though with less conviction than before. "Were you?" Calvin asked. "Because Amara tells me you haven't checked anyone else's boarding pass in first class on this flight. Not the elderly couple across from me. Not the businessmen in rows 1 and 2. Just me." The captain's jaw tightened, but he didn't deny it. "Let me tell you something about assumptions," Calvin said, leaning against the galley counter. "I've been dealing with them my whole life. When I was young, teachers assumed I wouldn't amount to much because of where I came from. When I started making music, critics assumed I was just another voice that would fade away. When I became successful, people assumed I'd crash and burn like so many others." He paused, letting his words sink in. "Every time I had to work twice as hard to prove those assumptions wrong. And the crazy thing is, even now, after everything I've accomplished, I still walk into rooms or airplane cabins and see those same assumptions in people's eyes." For the first time, something like genuine curiosity flickered across Captain Wilson's face. "So what do you do about it?" he asked, the question escaping before he could stop himself. Calvin smiled slightly, recognizing the small opening. "I could get angry. Sometimes I do. I could shut down, walk away. Sometimes that's the right move for my peace of mind. But most days I choose to engage, to have conversations like this one." Outside the galley window, the plane soared above a blanket of clouds, moonlight turning them silver. Below, invisible in the darkness, countless lives unfolded, each person carrying their own assumptions, judgments, hopes, and fears. "Let me ask you something," Calvin said, his tone conversational rather than confrontational. "You have a family?" The unexpected question caught the captain off guard. "Yes," he answered cautiously. "A wife, 2 grown kids," Calvin nodded. "And if someone looked at your kids and made assumptions about them, about their character, their worth, their right to be somewhere, based solely on what they look like, how would that make you feel?" The captain fell silent, the hypothetical scenario clearly hitting home in a way the abstract discussion of bias hadn't. "My son is a junior in college," Captain Wilson said finally, his voice softer than before. "Engineering major. Works harder than anyone I know. If someone—" He trailed off, the parallel suddenly clear to him. "Exactly," Calvin said gently. "We all want the same things, Captain. To be seen for who we are, not what we look like. To be judged by our actions, our character, our work, not by assumptions about where we belong or don't belong." Amara appeared discreetly at the edge of the curtain, gesturing to indicate that the captain's break was nearly over. Captain Wilson acknowledged her with a small nod before turning back to Calvin. "I need to get back," he said, but made no move to leave, as if the conversation had rooted him to the spot. "Before you go," Calvin said, sensing the moment was right, "I want to share something with you. The reason I'm on this flight isn't for a concert or a party. I'm heading to LA to launch a youth program in Compton, where I grew up. We're providing music education, coding classes, and mentorship to kids who are growing up like I did, surrounded by people telling them where they don't belong." He pulled out his phone and showed the captain a photo of a group of young people standing in front of a renovated building, their faces bright with hope and pride. "These kids are brilliant, talented, and determined, but every day they face the same assumptions I faced, the same ones I still face, like tonight on this plane. And every time someone acts on those assumptions, it reinforces the message that they don't belong in certain spaces, that their dreams have boundaries based on their skin color." Captain Wilson studied the photo, really looked at it, perhaps seeing for the first time the human cost of the procedures he'd been following so rigidly. "Your 5 minutes are up," he said finally, but his tone had changed, less defensive, more reflective. "I should get back to the cockpit." Calvin nodded and slipped his phone back into his pocket. "Thank you for listening, Captain. That's all I was asking for." The captain hesitated, then asked, "This program of yours, does it have a website?" The question, small as it was, represented something significant, a willingness to extend the conversation, to learn more. "It does," Calvin said, genuine surprise in his voice. He took out a business card and wrote the website on the back. "If you're ever in LA and want to see what we're doing, the door's open." Captain Wilson accepted the card, studying it for a moment before tucking it into his pocket. "I need to go," he said again, but still he lingered. "For what it's worth?" he began, then stopped, seemingly struggling with words that didn't come easily to him. Calvin waited, giving him space. "I made an assumption," the captain admitted finally, the words coming out with difficulty. "I saw you and I made an assumption. And that's not—" He stopped again, took a breath. "That's not the kind of pilot I want to be, or the kind of person." It wasn't exactly an apology, but it was something perhaps more valuable. An acknowledgement, a small crack in a wall built over decades. "We all make assumptions," Calvin said. "The question is what we do when someone calls us on them." Captain Wilson nodded, something like respect flickering in his eyes. "I should go," he said for the third time, and this time he moved toward the cockpit door. Before opening it, he turned back. "Mr. Johnson," he said formally, "thank you for your patience with this misunderstanding." Calvin smiled slightly. "Still not quite an apology, Captain, but it's a start." A ghost of a smile touched the captain's lips before he disappeared into the cockpit. Calvin stood alone in the galley for a moment, processing what had just happened. The conversation hadn't gone as expected, it had gone better. No shouting, no viral-worthy confrontation. Just two human beings finding a small patch of common ground at 35,000 feet. As he made his way back to his seat, Amara caught his eye and gave him a subtle thumbs up. Several passengers watched him curiously, clearly wondering what had transpired. The elderly man across the aisle leaned over as Calvin buckled his seatbelt. "Well?" he asked quietly. "Did you straighten him out?" Calvin considered the question. "Not exactly," he replied honestly. "But I think we both learned something." The man looked disappointed. "Sometimes people like that need to be put in their place." "Maybe," Calvin agreed. "But sometimes they just need to see us as human. Really see us." He reclined his seat slightly and gazed out the window at the star-filled sky. The confrontation had drained him, but there was also a quiet satisfaction in knowing he had chosen a different path. Not one of public shame and outrage, but of private connection and understanding. On his phone, he pulled up the photo of the youth program participants again. Their faces reminded him why moments like this mattered. It wasn't just about him and his experience on one flight. It was about all the kids who would come after him, whose paths might be a little easier if people like Captain Wilson began to question their assumptions. The seatbelt sign dinged on as the plane encountered a patch of turbulence. Calvin put his phone away and closed his eyes, wondering what would happen when they landed in Los Angeles. The conversation with the captain had ended on a note of tentative understanding, but people often retreated to familiar patterns once the moment passed. Would Captain Wilson go back to his old ways once they were on the ground? Would he dismiss their conversation as an anomaly, a momentary weakness? Or had something genuinely shifted in how he saw the world and the people in it? Calvin didn't know. But he had done what he could with the opportunity presented to him. He had spoken his truth, person to person, and for once someone had actually listened. It wasn't justice. It wasn't systemic change, but it was something. A small ripple that just might grow into something larger. For now, that would have to be enough. The next 2 hours of the flight passed uneventfully. Calvin dozed off for a while, then woke to accept the dinner service. Amara seemed to take special care with his meal, making sure everything was to his liking. The elderly couple across the aisle had struck up a conversation with a young woman seated nearby, and Calvin could hear snippets of their discussion about what had happened during boarding. "Did you see the video?" The young woman whispered, not quite quietly enough. "Someone already posted it online." "It's getting thousands of views," Calvin sighed inwardly. Of course it was. In today's world, privacy was an illusion, especially for someone like him. He pulled out his phone, switching it to airplane mode to check if any messages had come through the in-flight Wi-Fi. Several texts from his manager appeared, along with links to the video that was already making rounds on social media. "You okay?" His manager had written. "This looks bad. We should get ahead of it." Statement. Calvin stared at the message, considering his response. A public statement was the expected move, condemning the captain's actions, highlighting yet another instance of discrimination, perhaps calling for the airline to take action. It was the familiar playbook, one he'd followed before, but something held him back. The conversation in the galley had been different. Imperfect, yes. Incomplete, certainly, but there had been a moment of genuine connection, a tiny shift in understanding that could be crushed under the weight of public outrage. "No statement yet," he texted back. "Let's wait until we land. I'll call you." He put his phone away and returned to looking out the window. The clouds had thinned, revealing the vast landscape of America passing beneath them. From this height, there were no visible borders, no divisions, just the shared tapestry of land that belonged to everyone. As the flight entered its final hour, Calvin noticed increased activity in the first-class cabin. Amara and another flight attendant were whispering together, glancing occasionally in his direction. The cockpit door opened, and the first officer emerged, making his way down the aisle to use the bathroom. On his return, he paused beside Calvin's seat. "Everything going all right, Mr. Johnson?" he asked, his tone professional but friendly. "Fine, thanks," Calvin replied. "How much longer until we land?" "About 45 minutes, First Officer Thomas said." He hesitated, then added in a lower voice, "The captain asked me to check on you, actually." Calvin raised an eyebrow, surprised. "Did he?" Thomas nodded. "For what it's worth, he seems different, quieter. I've flown with him dozens of times, and I've never seen him like this." Before Calvin could respond, The cockpit door opened again. Captain Wilson himself stood in the doorway, scanning the cabin until his eyes landed on Calvin. For a moment, their gazes locked, neither man revealing what they were thinking. Then, to the surprise of everyone watching, the captain began walking down the aisle directly toward Calvin's seat. The cabin fell quiet. Passengers who had been chatting or watching movies looked up, sensing something significant was about to happen. The woman who had been recording earlier reached subtly for her phone again. Captain Wilson stopped beside Calvin's seat, his posture still rigid but somehow less imposing than before. He cleared his throat. "Mr. Johnson," he said, his voice carrying in the hushed cabin. "May I have a word?" Calvin nodded, unsure what to expect. The captain glanced around, suddenly aware of their audience. "Perhaps somewhere more private?" he suggested. "Whatever you have to say, Captain, you can say it here," Calvin replied calmly. It wasn't a challenge but a simple statement of fact. After what had happened during boarding, he wasn't interested in hiding the resolution, if that's what this was, from the other passengers. The captain seemed to understand. He straightened his shoulders, hands clasped behind his back in a formal stance that seemed to give him courage. "Very well," he said. "I owe you an apology." A ripple of surprise went through the cabin. The elderly woman across the aisle clutched her husband's arm, eyes wide. Several phones were now openly recording the moment. "When you boarded this aircraft," Captain Wilson continued, each word deliberate, "I made assumptions about you based solely on your appearance. I questioned your right to be in first class despite your valid boarding pass. I singled you out in a way I did not single out other passengers." He paused, taking a breath as if the next words were even more difficult. "That was wrong of me. It was unprofessional, it was unfair, and it was biased." The last word seemed to cost him something to say out loud. Calvin watched him carefully, noting the mix of discomfort and determination on his face. "Our conversation during my break," the captain went on, "made me realize that I've been operating on autopilot in more ways than one. Making snap judgments without questioning why I'm making them. Seeing threats and problems where there are only people trying to go about their lives just like me." The cabin remained absolutely silent, every passenger hanging on his words. Even the background hum of the engines seemed to fade as the captain continued. "I'm not saying one conversation fixed everything. I've got thinking to do, but I wanted to say publicly that I was wrong, and I'm sorry." He extended his hand to Calvin, a mirror of their earlier moment in the galley, but this time in full view of everyone. Calvin looked at the offered hand, then up at the captain's face. The man's expression was a complex mixture of emotions. Embarrassment. Yes, but also something that looked like genuine regret, and perhaps the first stirrings of growth. Without hesitation, Calvin took his hand and shook it firmly. "Thank you, Captain," he said simply. "That couldn't have been easy." "No," Captain Wilson agreed, a ghost of a smile touching his lips. "But necessary." Their handshake lasted only a few seconds, but in that brief connection, something shifted in the atmosphere of the cabin. It wasn't just the resolution of the earlier conflict. It was the rare sight of someone in authority acknowledging a mistake and taking responsibility for it. As the captain turned to go, spontaneous applause broke out among the passengers. It started with the elderly couple and spread quickly, filling the cabin with the sound of appreciation for what they had just witnessed. Captain Wilson looked startled, clearly not expecting this reaction. His face flushed slightly, but he gave a small nod of acknowledgement before returning to the cockpit, his back straight and his steps measured. As the applause died down, Calvin found himself surrounded by fellow passengers offering words of support and admiration. "That was incredible," said a businessman who had been quietly working on his laptop for most of the flight. "I've never seen anything like it." "You handled that with such grace," added a woman a few rows ahead who had turned around in her seat. "Most people would have escalated the situation, but you found a way to create understanding. The way you stood your ground without becoming angry," said the elderly man across the aisle, shaking his head in wonder. "You taught that captain something today, son. And the rest of us, too." Calvin accepted their comments with quiet thanks, feeling a mixture of emotions himself. Relief that the situation had been resolved peacefully. Pride in how he'd handled it. Hope that perhaps the captain's words were genuine. And exhaustion from the emotional roller coaster of the past few hours. Amara appeared at his side with a fresh glass of water. That was something else, she said softly as she placed it on his tray table. I've been flying for 12 years and I've never seen a captain apologize to a passenger like that. Especially not in front of everyone. Calvin smiled. People can surprise you sometimes. They can, she agreed. And for what it's worth, I think he meant it. I saw his face when he came out of the galley after your talk. Something got through to him. The captain's voice came over the intercom announcing their initial descent into Los Angeles. As the plane began its gradual descent, Calvin looked out at the city lights beginning to appear below, thinking about the ripple effects of what had just happened. The video of the initial confrontation was already online, viewed by thousands. But now there would be a second video, one showing an ending few would have predicted. Not a story of outrage and division, but of acknowledgement, apology, and the tentative beginnings of change. His phone buzzed again with another message from his manager. Video of the apology is blowing up. Calls coming in from news outlets. What's our play here? Calvin stared at the message, considering the question carefully. The easy answer would be to ride the wave of positive publicity, to position himself as the bigger person who educated an ignorant captain. It would be good for his image, good for his brand, but something about that approach felt wrong, too simplistic, too self-serving. What had happened on this flight wasn't about him getting recognition for handling discrimination with grace. It was about a genuine human connection that had led to a moment of transformation. For the captain, yes, but maybe for him too. As the plane descended through the clouds, Calvin made his decision. He would decline the interview requests. He would not make a public statement about the incident. Instead, he would do something more meaningful. He pulled up the contact information for his youth program and began drafting an email. They would need a speaker for next month's workshop on leadership and accountability. Someone with experience, someone who understood the importance of recognizing and addressing bias. Someone like Captain Wilson. It was a long shot. The captain might refuse, might retreat back into his comfortable assumptions once the moment passed. But Calvin had seen something real in the man's eyes during that public apology, a willingness to grow, to learn, to be uncomfortable in service of becoming better. And sometimes, that was all you needed to start changing the world. One person, one conversation, one moment of honest connection at a time. The seatbelt sign chimed as the plane continued its descent toward Los Angeles, carrying everyone on board toward an ending none of them had expected when they first took their seats. And perhaps, for some, toward a new beginning. The plane touched down at LAX with a gentle bump, wheels screeching against the runway as it slowed. Outside the windows, the lights of Los Angeles glittered against the night sky, a constellation of human activity stretching as far as the eye could see. As the aircraft taxied toward the terminal, passengers began the familiar routine of gathering belongings and checking phones. Calvin remained seated, watching as the cabin filled with the sounds of unbuckling seatbelts and opening overhead compartments. His own phone had been buzzing nonstop since they'd entered cell service range. News of both the initial confrontation and the unexpected apology had spread quickly across social media, drawing reactions from fans, celebrities, and commentators alike. "What are you going to say?" asked the elderly man across the aisle, nodding toward Calvin's phone. "They'll all want to hear from you," Calvin smiled. "Less than you might think," he replied. "I've found that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is let a story speak for itself." The captain's voice came over the intercom one last time, thanking everyone for flying with them and wishing them a pleasant evening in Los Angeles. To most passengers, it was the standard end-of-flight announcement. But Calvin caught the slight pause before Captain Wilson added, "And a reminder that respect and understanding make every journey better." It was small, perhaps even unnoticeable to most, but to Calvin it suggested that their conversation had indeed left a mark. As the seatbelt sign dinged off, passengers began moving toward the exits. Several stopped by Calvin's seat, offering words of support or simply a nod of acknowledgement. A young mother with a sleeping toddler in her arms paused beside him. "My son is 6, she said quietly. "Mixed race like me. I've been trying to figure out how to prepare him for a world that might judge him before knowing him." Her eyes glistened with unshed tears. "What you did today, how you handled that situation, that's what I want to teach him. Strength with grace. Standing up for yourself without losing your humanity." Before Calvin could respond, she continued down the aisle, her sleeping child none the wiser about the moment that had just transpired. But Calvin felt the weight of her words. So often, incidents like the one he'd experienced were seen as isolated moments of injustice. But they were actually threads in a larger tapestry, connected to countless lives and futures. Amara appeared beside his seat as the cabin emptied. "The captain asked if you would mind waiting until the other passengers have deplaned," she said. "He'd like a word with you at the door." Calvin nodded, curious but not apprehensive. He gathered his belongings and waited as the last few passengers exited. When the cabin was finally empty, he made his way toward the front, where Captain Wilson stood near the exit door, his formal posture slightly more relaxed than earlier. "Mr. Johnson," the captain said as Calvin approached. "Captain," Calvin acknowledged with a nod. For a moment, neither spoke. The empty cabin around them was oddly peaceful after the bustle of deplaning. "I wanted to thank you," Captain Wilson said finally. "You had every right to file a formal complaint, to demand consequences. Instead, He paused, searching for the right words. "You offered a different path." Calvin studied the man's face, seeing genuine reflection there. "People rarely change when they're backed into a corner," he said simply. "Shame is a powerful motivator, but not always for the better." The captain nodded slowly. "I've been flying for nearly 3 decades, he said. "I've developed habits of thinking, ways of assessing situations and people quickly. In my line of work, quick judgment can be necessary." He looked away briefly, gazing down the empty aisle of the aircraft that had been his domain for so many years. But somewhere along the way, I stopped questioning those judgments. Started seeing what I expected to see, not what was actually there. He turned back to Calvin. "Your boarding pass was perfectly valid. You belonged in first class just as much as any other passenger. But I didn't see that because I wasn't really looking." "And now?" Calvin asked. "Now I'm trying to look differently," Captain Wilson replied. "It's not comfortable, but it's necessary." He reached into his pocket and pulled out the business card Calvin had given him earlier, with a youth program website written on the back. "I looked this up during my break. The work you're doing with these kids, it's impressive." "They're impressive," Calvin corrected gently. "I'm just giving them tools and space to shine." The captain turned the card over in his hands, then looked up with an expression Calvin hadn't seen from him before. Something like humility mixed with resolve. "In your program description, it mentions bringing in guest speakers to talk about leadership and overcoming challenges," he said. "I'm not sure I'm qualified to speak about overcoming prejudice, given that I'm still working on my own. But if you think my perspective might be valuable, as someone trying to recognize and address bias, I'd be willing to talk to your students." The offer hung in the air between them, unexpected and sincere. Calvin felt a smile spread across his face as he realized his idea from earlier had manifested without him even having to suggest it. "That," he said, extending his hand, "would be exactly what they need to hear. Not someone perfect, but someone honest. Someone making the effort to grow." They shook hands, this time with genuine mutual respect. "I'll be in touch about scheduling," Calvin added as they moved toward the exit. "And Captain, for what it's worth, what you did today, acknowledging your mistake publicly, that took courage." The captain seemed about to dismiss the compliment, then thought better of it. "Thank you," he said simply. "Safe travels in Los Angeles, Mr. Johnson." "Safe skies, Captain Wilson," Calvin replied as he stepped onto the jet bridge and headed toward the terminal. The airport buzzed with the usual activity, travelers rushing to make connections, families reuniting, workers handling the constant flow of people and luggage. Calvin moved through it all in a contemplative mood, reflecting on the unexpected journey of the past few hours. As he approached the baggage claim area, he saw a small crowd gathered, some holding phones aloft, clearly waiting for him. News crews. Of course. A woman with a microphone spotted him first and hurried over, cameraman in tow. "Mr. Johnson," Laura Chen from Channel 7 News. "Your confrontation with an airline captain has gone viral. Can you tell viewers what happened and how you're feeling about it now?" More reporters joined her, creating a circle of cameras and microphones around him. Calvin took a deep breath, remembering his earlier decision not to feed the media cycle. "It was a misunderstanding that turned into a learning opportunity," he said calmly, "for everyone involved." The video shows the captain singling you out and questioning your right to be in first class, another reporter pressed. Many are calling it a clear case of racial profiling. Are you planning to take action against the airline? Calvin shook his head. What I'm planning is to continue the conversation that started on that plane. Not through press statements or lawsuits, but through direct engagement. The captain and I have already discussed next steps. The reporters looked confused, clearly expecting outrage or at least demands for accountability. A young journalist pushed forward. But don't you think there should be consequences? A message needs to be sent that this kind of behavior is unacceptable. Calvin nodded thoughtfully. The strongest message was already sent, when the captain came out in front of the entire cabin and acknowledged his mistake. That took courage, and it shows that change is possible when we engage with each other as human beings, not just as symbols in a larger cultural battle. He looked directly into the nearest camera, knowing his words would reach far beyond this airport. I've experienced discrimination my entire life. I know the anger and frustration it causes, but I also know that lasting change doesn't come from public shaming or quick firings. It comes from the harder, slower work of changing hearts and minds, including our own. The reporters exchanged glances, unsure how to respond to this measured take. It didn't fit neatly into the narrative of outrage and retaliation that drove so much coverage of similar incidents. So what happens next? Asked Laura Chen, genuinely curious now. Calvin smiled. Next, the captain is going to speak to the youth in my program about his experience, about recognizing bias and having the courage to address it. And next, all of us need to examine our own assumptions about others, because we all make them whether we realize it or not. He glanced at his watch. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have a busy day tomorrow launching our new music studio for the kids. As he moved past the reporters toward the exit, his phone buzzed with a new notification. The video of the captain's apology had been viewed over 1 million times already, with thousands of comments expressing surprise and respect for how the situation had been handled by both men. Outside, the warm Los Angeles night greeted him. His driver waited by the curb holding a sign with his name. As Calvin approached, the man smiled broadly. Saw what happened on your flight, he said, taking Calvin's bag. Man, that was something else. The way you handled it, the way that pilot stepped up. Don't see that every day. No. Calvin agreed as he slid into the back seat. But maybe we could. As the car pulled away from the curb, Calvin gazed out at the city lights. The past 6 hours had been unexpected in every way. What had started as yet another demoralizing encounter with prejudice had transformed into something rare and valuable. Moment of genuine human connection and growth. He knew the cynics would say nothing had really changed, that the captain's apology was just for show, that the system remained broken, that tomorrow would bring fresh injustices. And they wouldn't be entirely wrong. One conversation on one airplane couldn't fix centuries of bias and discrimination, but it was a start. A reminder that beneath the labels and assumptions we place on each other, there exists the possibility of recognition, of seeing and being seen as fully human. Calvin thought of the young mother on the plane and of the children in his program who would hear the captain's story. Perhaps for them, the world would be slightly different. Perhaps they would grow up expecting more from themselves and others. More honesty, more accountability, more courage to acknowledge mistakes and grow from them. As the car merged onto the freeway, he watched the planes taking off from LAX, their lights tracing paths into the night sky. Somewhere up there, other journeys were beginning. Other conversations were taking place. Other opportunities for connection were unfolding. All it took was the willingness to recognize them when they appeared, and the courage to choose a different path forward.